story begins with Carroll Shelby, a brave and talented race car driver, remembering his triumph at the tough 1959 24 Hours of Le Mans race. But suddenly, a doctor calls out to him, warning that his heart is in danger and he can no longer race. Feeling reckless, Shelby takes a pill, jumps into his car, and speeds away down the road. Meanwhile, in a small garage, young Peter Miles plays with his toy car, while his father, Ken Miles, helps a frustrated customer whose car is having problems. Ken tries to give advice, but the angry customer leaves, swearing at him. Just then, Molly, Ken's loving wife, walks in and playfully flirts with him, bringing a smile to his face. At the big Ford factory, Vice President Henry Ford II talks to his workers about the company's rich history and urges them to think of ideas to save their jobs. As the workers listen, they feel the pressure of the moment. Later, Phil Remington knocks on Shelby's camper van to wake him up. Back at the racing track, Ken's car gets disqualified because it doesn't meet the rules. Shelby hears Ken arguing with a race official and sees Dieter Voss, a sponsor, watching Ken's anger. After Ken throws a wrench at Shelby in frustration, things get tense. As the big race starts, Shelby watches Ken compete. Suddenly, an old rival, Sam Hanks, mocks Shelby's past as a racer. But despite the odds, Ken wins the race, impressing Dieter. That night, Molly worries when she finds out the IRS has locked their garage, and Ken promises to fix it. In a meeting, Lee Iacocca shares his idea for Ford to enter the racing world, but Henry is skeptical. He knows that Ferrari has a strong reputation for winning, and if Ford can beat Ferrari, they will become legendary. The next day, Ken thinks about quitting racing to save their garage, but Molly insists he should keep racing. Lee visits Enzo Ferrari at his factory, hoping to create a partnership, but Ferrari turns him down and mocks Ford. Later, Henry learns that Fiat has bought Ferrari, and he instructs Lee to find the best team to build a winning race car. Lee meets Shelby to discuss creating a car to win the 24 Hours of Le Mans. Shelby is hesitant, but mentions Ken's talent as a driver. That evening, Shelby approaches Ken with a bold plan. They need to build a car in just 90 days for racing. At first, Ken laughs, but Shelby convinces him to at least come to the launch of a new Mustang. On launch day, Ken and his son Peter arrive, excited to see Shelby spectacularly land a jet. During Shelby's speech, Ken feels overwhelmed and leaves with Peter. Outside, Shelby waits and invites Ken for a ride. Ken is curious but cautious, especially when Molly sees them. At the airport, Shelby reveals a powerful racing car, the Ford GT40 Mk1. Ken drives it and shares his thoughts about improvement. The next day, he and Molly take the car for a spin, and she pushes him to be honest about his feelings. Eventually, Ken admits he would earn good money if he joined Shelby's team. Soon, Ken starts training with Shelby, testing the GT40's parts and getting ready for the race. However, Shelby has doubts about Ken's racing image and decides not to attend Le Mans. Ken listens to the race on the radio, frustrated by the mistakes in the car's design. Molly comforts him when she finds him upset. At a meeting, Shelby tells Henry Ford that their car is getting faster, even if they face challenges. Shelby gains Henry's trust and excitement, builds for the upcoming race. One day, Shelby surprises Ken with the news that they will build the GT40 together again. However, in a moment of anger, Ken punches Shelby, leading to a playful fight while Molly watches. Afterward, they all share a soda, and the trio dives into the hard work of building and perfecting the GT40, ready to face Ferrari head-on. As Ken practices his driving skills in preparation for the upcoming race, Shelby receives an urgent call from Lee. Lee informs Shelby that Bibi, who will soon take charge of the racing team, wants Ken out. Lee advises Shelby to stay calm when Bibi arrives at the workplace the next day. While Shelby is still on the phone, Ken suddenly loses his brakes, causing a massive explosion. Thankfully, Ken emerges from the wreckage unharmed, and everyone is relieved. After the incident, Ken speaks with Phil, instructing him to design a new assembly for the car. However, Phil has a different idea. He suggests that they replace the entire braking system, including the rotors, on the GT40. Ken, curious, asks if they can swap out individual parts, to which Phil confirms they can. Later on, Shelby explains that Bibi is now in control of the situation and advises Ken to trust him as he prepares to execute a high-risk plan. The next day, Bibi and Henry arrive at the workplace. Bibi requests a private conversation with Shelby in his office. Once inside, Bibi reveals that he is now the overall executive director of the racing program. Shelby simply nods, then exits the office, locking Bibi inside. Despite Bieb's shouts for help, everyone in the car factory ignores him and carries on with their scheme. Meanwhile, Shelby distracts Henry, by offering him a ride in the race car. Shelby starts the engine and drives at high speed. After a few minutes, Shelby brings the car to a stop, and Henry, overwhelmed, begins to sob. He realizes that driving a race car is not something just anyone can do. It requires skill and control. Shelby seizes the moment to emphasize that Ken is the only person capable of winning the Le Mans race. Just as they are discussing this, Ken arrives unexpectedly. That evening, Shelby successfully secures a deal with Henry, and Ken is finally given the green light to compete in Ford's race program for the upcoming Le Mans event. As Shelby and Phil watch Ken practice on the track, Shelby orders the marshals to stay alert. Ken notices Hanks and gives him a smirk. Suddenly, Ken witnesses Hanks crashing into another racer's car, causing it to explode. Fortunately, Ken narrowly avoids the collision. Ken returns to the pit stop to refuel and change tires. He then informs Shelby about Hanks, who managed to take out the Mustang on the track. After 23 hours of grueling racing in Daytona, the event continues. The commentator announces that Hanks is leading the race, with Ken close behind. As Shelby watches intently, he notices Lee and other Ford executives celebrating the success of the race program. In a sudden burst of inspiration, Shelby writes, 7,000 plus go like hell on a placard and heads toward the track to show it to Ken. Fortunately, Ken sees the message and follows Shelby's advice. Meanwhile, Molly and Peter anxiously listen to the radio, which is broadcasting updates on Ken's race. As the race nears its conclusion, Ken carefully times his move and accelerates his car. When he catches up to Hanks, Ken shouts at him, swiftly shifts gears, and follows the RPM instructions that Shelby had written on the placard. In a thrilling finish, Ken crosses the finish line first, securing victory. Henry receives a call in the Ford Motor Company's meeting room, confirming that Ford has won Daytona. That night, after celebrating the Shelby American team's victory, Ken spends some quiet time with his family. Later, Ken checks on Peter, who is still awake and drawing a map. Ken joins Peter in and everyone is gathered outside with Ken. He still had the nerve and excitement to be back on the road, but tragically this time, the brakes abandoned him, and he lost control of his vehicle.
Hit the van!
He succumbs to his death as his son witnessed it along with Shelby. Soon Shelby is deeply affected by Ken's loss and struggles to find another racer with the same level of skill and determination. Despite the tragedy, Shelby went on to become one of the most successful and renowned sports car designers in history, while Ken is posthumously honored with an induction into the Motorsports Hall of Fame. The Ford GT40, developed by Shelby and Ken, won Le Mans in 1966, 1967, 1968, 1969,